What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a little bit of an update on the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion Remastered. After having a fantastic time covering this game via its shadow drop and everything, I haven't really had too much of a reason to talk about it since then, mostly because, it's still the same game for the most part, other than the changed mechanics, which I covered in all those videos. But since I have last talked about it, it has received two big patches, patch 1.1 and patch 1.2, though technically speaking, patch 1.2 is in a beta over on Steam right now, but I'm sure you take my meaning. The other thing I kind of wanted to talk about in this particular video, though, that was a little more difficult at the time, simply because of the nature of the shadow drop and everything, and just the timing, was basically kind of how the game itself was received, given that it is just a remaster of a much older version, that while very near and dear to me, I'm, well aware and was never under any illusion really translated to the modern day with its clunkier mechanics. In fact, one thing I would often say about those things, alongside many other people, is that Oblivion was a case of a lot of weird broken systems coming together to create something that was kind of bigger than the whole of its parts. Because I love Oblivion, as I've talked about many times on the channel. It's a very special game to me, alongside many other people who played it back when it originally released. And long story short, I just kind of wanted to see how it would hold up in people's estimations today. And now that it's been a few months, we can talk a bit about that. Now, before we dive fully into that, though, I do want to talk about the patches first, mostly because it's just not going to take very long, as there's only been 2 of them. And realistically, given the nature of this remaster, I would say the patches you would expect from this game are feature adjustments as well as, crashes and general fixes. I would not expect overhaul type patches that drastically change the game, at least content-wise, simply because of the nature of it being a remaster. And yet, in spite of that, just the 2 patches they have put out already have actually been pretty interesting. They've fixed some things I personally complained about in my review even, starting with patch 1.1. The biggest thing for me here was that they actually fixed the local map. If you watched my review of this when it initially released, I pointed out, as many others did, that the map was a little bit busted in the sense that there's an overworld map and then a local map of the actual, dungeon or city that you are in. For whatever reason, when you were in dungeons and things like that, it would not default to the local map. It would always pull up the over map, and that was a problem because then you'd have to scroll in and get to the local map every single time you opened the map. It would not memorize it. It was extremely annoying, honestly. But patch 1.1 also addressed a bunch of other stuff, but it was a little more straightforward. Unsurprisingly, a big focus on trying to fix some of the more prominent crashes that were with the release version, fixing some animation bugs, that kind of thing that slipped through. If you're unaware, this thing uses a Frankenstein of game engines to run the graphics overhaul to the base game, so not really a huge surprise that there were some issues there. They also fixed a few little quirks with the Daedric shrines. For whatever reason, those guys would not display subtitles. A couple of their shrines would actually have the voiceover get cut off or overlap improperly, so they fixed some of that with patch 1.1. There were some quest fixes, a few things with settings and whatnot. They fixed Vincent Valetieri's hair loss. He's a vampire in the Dark Brotherhood who is not supposed to lose his hair, but it was just bald for some reason. So that was a thing. But then there's patch 1.2. So one thing I, again, want to point out with patch 1.2, right now this is on beta via Steam. It is not currently on other consoles and stuff. I did not see in their update anywhere when they plan to actually bring this out of beta, but I would imagine it's probably not going to be too terribly long. Straight away, patch 1.2 introduces what was probably the single most requested thing since this version launched, which was an adjustment to the difficulty settings. They have divided the difficulty settings into both player combat damage and enemy combat damage, and each of these has its own separate adjustment, which includes the initial difficulty settings, but also adds 2 more via Apprentice and Journeyman. These are specifically there to level out some of the curves that cause some of the ridiculous difficulty spikes. For instance, going from Adept to Expert was a huge jump. So they've introduced Journeyman specifically to kind of bridge that gap and make that a smoother transition as you make your way up to Master. A very much requested feature, and obviously I'm glad to see it in here. Now, much like the first patch, the rest of this patch was just kind of smaller stuff in general, a lot more fixes. I will say they did focus a lot on fixing keybinds here, which I believe is something I mentioned in my review. Sometimes I would exit the game and it just wouldn't save my keybinds and I'd have to redo them when I started it back up, which was kind of annoying. They fixed a very prominent crash that was occurring when you would fight Gigalag in the Shivering Isles. That was a progress blocking one that they seem to have fixed. They also fixed some crashes related to paralyzing your enemies, alongside a bunch of what the patch notes describes as various GPU crashes, which could mean anything, honestly. And they also went on to fix more problems with a variety of quests, and again, animations. They said that they fixed a problem with player character height scaling. I think they are referring to the bug that would cause your character to get crazy big. They also fixed more animations here with things like the vampire sleeping animations. They're supposed to sleep, like a vampire with their arms folded and stuff. They were not doing that. They were just sleeping normally. I assume that's what that's talking about. With everything else being smaller and more technical. So overall, straight away, a good couple of patches, more or less in line with what I would expect to be the level of changes that they would be willing to make for this version. But certainly happy to see these adjustments anyway. Now, let's go a little bit farther though, and let's now talk about that critical reception I was mentioning, because if you look over on the Steam page, it's actually dropped a little bit from mostly positive overall to mixed with recent reviews. And if you actually dive into the Steam reviews, basically two things become clear. On one hand, people love the content and the presentation of Oblivion, which I love to hear about and see, and yet in spite of that, there are a lot of complaints about performance and optimization on individual people's systems. Now, I do want to point out that a game like Oblivion, and honestly most anything that Bethesda puts out, if you're doing things like running mods and utilizing those, you're probably going to run into more issues, and I don't think that's necessarily the game's fault. Another thing about PC is that hardware specs matter. If you're running this game on a PC that cannot handle it, you are going to run into performance problems. And I want to point out that because opinions on the actual optimization and, how well this game is running for people seem to be very split. Some people, like myself, seem to be encountering basically zero problems, whereas a significant chunk of people talk about various crashes, problems with saving and loading, low FPS, and that stuff could be caused by a million things. To be clear, though, that is not some defense of Bethesda either. Let's be real. This is a sizable chunk of people complaining about these problems. I am 100% positive that there is some element of truth to that, especially given that a lot of complaints people have made in recent reviews are things that patch 1.2 mentions specifically and that I just talked about, like that crash with Gigalag as an example. I just wanted to point out that there is a little bit of nuance in those particular discussions. So putting that all together, on one hand, I'm really happy that the content and the sort of, just charm, to use the common term, that people remembered Oblivion for has shined through for new players. That part is fantastic. I think a lot of people, especially given the updated presentation, the changes to the worst of Oblivion's mechanics to make them more user-friendly, and just all those little adjustments they made to make the game more playable, seem to have really landed with people and allowed this game to shine to a new generation. With, obviously, the really big caveat here that performance seems to be extraordinarily hit or miss. It does seem like patch 1.2 is aiming to fix a lot of the biggest complaints there, but obviously until that's in everybody's hands, we won't know how that is working for everybody because, again, I've never had much trouble running it to begin with, hence the hit or miss part. But yeah, simply put, it's a shame it doesn't run better because outside of these complaints about performance, they would have just completely knocked this out of the park. But that pretty much seems to be how this one landed, and that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about, so I suppose we'll go ahead and end it there. But I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.